Hello and welcome to Redux, which is a production of Regent College, Vancouver, in collaboration with Christianity Today. My name's Ewan Russell-Jones, and for the next hour we're going to be talking about a good death, mercy, mortality, and medically assisted dying. Just over a week ago, Canada joined a growing number of nations around the world when the Canadian Parliament passed legislation authorizing medically assisted dying, sometimes referred to as assisted suicide. What does this dramatic change in the law mean for the practice of medicine? And how should Christians respond? Does the new legislation achieve a proper balance between, on the one hand, mercy and compassion for patients in pain, and on the other, protection of the honor and dignity of human life? And what about the rights of conscience in this matter? What provisions are there for medical professionals who cannot, in all conscience, take part in assisted dying? I'll be discussing these questions with an outstanding group of Christian practitioners a bit later on in the program. And if you have any questions, you can submit them via the questions box on our webpage or via Twitter at Regent College. But first, we're going to spend some time looking into the roots of the support for assisted suicide in Canada. Last week, I spoke with Dr. Ellen Wiebe, a Vancouver-based doctor who's been a passionate advocate for assisted dying. Dr. Wiebe isn't just a vocal advocate either. She also participated in the first court-approved assisted death in Canada. I began by asking her about her motivation in backing this cause.
Well, I've been a doctor for over 40 years, and in the last 10 years, I had left general family practice behind and was doing just women's health. But when I discovered last fall that we were not going to have the palliative care physicians involved in assisted death, I realized that there would be a huge problem with access, that we were getting this new right for Canadians to have a medically assisted death, and yet the people who often do the end-of-life care would not be participating. So then I realized that I and a friend of mine needed to do something, and we got ourselves trained, and we got ready for February 6th, so that when February 6th happened, that there would be providers available for somebody who needed it.
Was this a feeling that doctors were letting patients down? I mean, was it a feeling of justice that you needed to do something to provide a kind of a means for people? Where was it coming from in terms of your kind of gut instinct?
That dying is often involves a lot of suffering, and the most difficult part is that you lose control over everything, and now that we had the legal right to take control back at that very crucial time of life, I just wanted to make sure there was access, and I knew that I could do it.
This assisted dying, it's obviously a huge notion, but I mean, what does it practically mean for a physician? I mean, what are you expected to do as a doctor to assist in someone's death?
Okay. Well, let me tell you a story. I can talk about Hannah Schaefer, the very first patient, because the publication ban was lifted, and because her husband and her best friend have given numerous interviews to the press with a lot of details. So it is now in the public domain, and I can tell you about her. So she was a 66-year-old psychologist, academic, who had 3 years of ALS, and during that time she lost her ability to speak. But what it meant for her was that her speech became garbled. She wasn't able to work. She lost the ability to move independently. Her legs and arms became very weak, and so she had to have full care. She wasn't able to eat. She had to have a feeding tube. And her life became narrower and narrower, and the things she loved to do, like dancing, were no longer able. And more important, I think, was the communication. She by the time I met her, she had movement in one finger and one thumb, and she could type on her iPad and was very articulate about her feelings and what she wanted. But she wasn't able to speak, and that was a terrible loss for her. So she had decided last summer that she wanted an assisted death, and at that point, the only way to do that was to travel to Switzerland. And she got her friend to make the arrangements, to help her make the arrangements to go to Switzerland to die. But her husband, he had a hard time with it. He was not ready to lose her yet, and he begged her to stay around for longer. So she did, for his sake. But by fall, he had come around, and he said, no, I can't ask her to keep suffering this way just for me, that, you know, he wasn't that selfish, that he could let her go. And so, of course, at that time, February 6th was getting closer, and she contacted me and asked whether I would help her. And I said I would. So then we went through the process, which involved lawyers and judges and affidavits and doctors and all of those things, which we don't have to deal with anymore. But until June 6th, we had to go through the court process. So once she had her approvals and we had all the documents in order, she and her husband and friend flew to Vancouver to me, and I had the medication ready. So at the actual time, she got an IV in her arm, and I gave her 3 medications. And the first one, she went to sleep. The second one, she went into a full coma. And the third one stopped the breathing in her heart. And what she looked like was somebody going to sleep. So that's what her husband and her friend saw, one on each side of her. Just as I gave the first injection, she looked at her husband and mouthed. She could move her face, but she couldn't actually say words. But he said that he understood her perfectly. She said to him, "I love you." And then she looked at me, and she had this wonderful smile on her face, like a smile of triumph. She had worked really hard to get to this point, and she was so sure and was wasn't sad at all. she looked triumphant. Now, what she had avoided, because of course I have seen ALS patients go through the next stage, was the choking to death. So what happens after you can no longer speak, no longer eat? Her weakness was getting into the breathing muscles, so that she was no longer able to take a deep breath, and she would have just been had air hunger and would have died choking because she could no longer control any of her own secretions. So it's pretty awful death. And so she avoided that, and she did it her way, and she was very much in charge, and it felt really, really good to help her.
So sometimes this process is kind of referred to as assisted suicide, but I mean, this isn't assisted suicide. This is actually the professional taking charge of a situation and administering drugs that will result in the death of this person. Now, that is a new situation for doctors, isn't it? And you're a doctor. I mean, so how do you feel about this? Because, you know, for a lot of people, this is actually the antithesis of what medicine is about.
No, the essence of medicine is relieving suffering. You know, that old statement: cure sometimes, relieve mostly, comfort always. And that is the essence of medicine, and it's been my profession for 41 years. It's very much a part of what I've always done and will do as long as I work, is cure sometimes, relieve often and comfort always. And this is a situation where doctors are helpless. I mean, we can't stave off death. Death happens to everybody. And giving somebody a good death is one of the most satisfying things one can do in medicine, and I've done that before with good palliative care, adjusting the morphine just right, taking care of the secretions, what we do in palliative care, which is to help ease people out. And that's a very satisfying work to give really good palliative care. But what a palliative care cannot do is give people autonomy when they've lost the ability to do anything for themselves, and they hate that so much. They find that the worst part of suffering, that there's nothing that we can do as doctors to give them back any of that autonomy. And even with the other kinds of symptoms, there's about 5% of dying patients where the best palliative care does not relieve their symptoms. Only 5%. I mean, 95% is pretty good, but not good enough for those 5%.
No, it's obviously a massively important decision, this. And, it's terminal, isn't it? So whatever one's position on this, I mean, clearly there have to be safeguards of some kind surrounding the decision that is made. What, for you, are the important considerations here? I mean, do you agree with the safeguards that have been put in place by the Canadian government, or do you think they're too stringent? I mean, what's your kind of bottom line here as far as the safeguarding the decision, the integrity of this process?
So I'm happy with what the Canadian government has done. There are things I would like to see improved, and for example, as you know, people want advance directives and they want mental illness, and I'm very sure that Canada's not quite ready for those things.
I mean, families put pressure on people. We know this from just personal observation.
Oh, yeah.
And a lot of people worry too that maybe the state will begin to put pressure on people who are kind of seen as a burden upon society. How do we safeguard? How do we make sure that we are not on some slippery slope to a kind of a society which basically indulges in euthanasia for its own economic purposes?
Well, I think we can trust our society to not be vastly different from the ones who've had a lot of experience with this. So the places that have had experience, Switzerland has had assisted suicide legal since the 1940s. In the Netherlands, they've had the law courts have given the right before the Parliament did. And so they've had euthanasia in the Netherlands since the 1970s and 80s. And in those places, we do not have an increase in vulnerable people seeking it. Who seeks assisted death there and here? It's people like you and me, highly educated, white, wealthy, and used to being in charge of their lives. These are the people who choose assisted death by much more than people who are less educated, poor, and so on. So it's not the vulnerable people; it's the type A's who tend to choose it. So that's what's happened in the countries that have had it for decades, and it's highly unlikely that Canada is going to be much different than that. In terms of family pressure, well, we're talking about love, we're talking about guilt, and those aren't things that can ever be legislated. People love each other. People have relationships that are rather entangled, and so our job as a society, and for me as a physician who provides assisted death, is to make sure that the person really wants it for themselves. And I check out what the family members are feeling and saying, and can I absolutely prevent something like that? No, no more than I can prevent love and guilt. And can a legislation or a regulation prevent that? No. But I can tell you that what happens is what happened with Hannah Schaefer. I'm seeing this kind of process all along. Either by the time I meet a patient asking for an assisted death, everybody is on side. They say, we can't ask him to suffer anymore. It would be selfish to ask, my father to continue when his life is now limited to lying in bed and he can no longer eat and so on. I can't ask him to suffer more than that. And so this is what I'm seeing, is that it might not come quickly. It might take a while for a loved one to be able to get to that point, but they take the time and then they get.
Okay. Well, it seems that we lost the end of the interview with Dr. Ellen Wiebe there. But that was an edited version of an interview I conducted with her last week. And if you're interested, you'll be able to see the whole thing on our website later on after this program. Joining me now to discuss the issue of assisted dying are a group of people who are especially qualified to speak to these questions. Edwin Hui is Professor of Bioethics and Dean of the Chinese Studies Program here at Regent College. He's a clinician and a scientist who's published many books and articles in the field of ethics. Before coming to Regent, he held positions as the Vice Chief of Staff at Lakewood Hospital in Los Angeles in the USA, and as Professor of Medical Ethics at the University of Hong Kong. Welcome, Edwin.
Thank you.
Our next guest is Tim Morn, who's Professor of Clinical Oncology at the University of Oxford in the UK. And he's Clinical Director of the Oxford Institute for Radiation Oncology. Tim has worked as a specialist in the treatment of cancer for many years, and he's a prominent member of the Christian Medical Fellowship, who's given evidence to parliamentary commissions and has campaigned against the legalization of assisted dying in the UK. Welcome, Tim. And last but not least is Philip Weaver, who's the Manager of Spiritual Health at Providence Healthcare, a Catholic healthcare provider in British Columbia, Canada. Philip has extensive experience walking alongside patients in the midst of illness and at the end of life. As well as leading the pastoral care teams at 2 large hospitals in Vancouver, he also oversees the training of future professionals in this field. Philip was recently appointed President of the Canadian Association for Spiritual Care. Welcome, Philip.
Thanks.
And we'll begin with you, Philip Weaver. How do you respond to this development in Canadian law and to what Dr. Weaver said there?
I think one of the things that was quite clear in what she was saying is that the notion of autonomy seems to be paramount in her mind and in this discussion. The notion of people continuing to have control over their lives. And of course, that's a huge assumption that we actually get to have control over our lives in our ordinary existence. Certainly from a Christian perspective, we would perhaps the words of the Heidelberg Catechism, that our only comfort in life and in death is that we do not belong to ourselves, but belong to our faithful Savior. So that sense of how much control do we have in our lives and how much can we exercise that at the end of life is certainly part of that assumption.
And as somebody who's working in Canada at the moment, I mean, how do you respond to this legislation? What does it put you in a spin?
I think it is pretty representative of many people's positions in Canada. So, it's hard to know exactly what is a pluralistic view or what is a majority view, but I think it does represent the will of most people in Canada, that there would be some way in which people can choose to go out on their own terms. Now that, what the values that's based on may not be ones that we would share necessarily, but I think that there is that point certainly can be made, that it's what most people want.
Professor Tim Morn, what did you make of what you heard there and of this new situation in Canada?
Well, Dr. Weaver came across as a very caring physician who was concerned to do best for people who came to her for this service. It seemed that these were not people who she had long-term interactions with, but they came to her for this particular intervention. I want to pick up on just one issue that she said. There's nothing that we doctors can do to give back autonomy. And I think that as a society we need to think about that, because what people lose at this point is the sense that they are still valuable, they are still in a relationship with people, and even though physically they become very limited. My experience is that the vast majority of people actually still really yearn for good relationship, and they want those relationships around them. And it's as we see those relationships closing down that people want out. So I think the idea of looking to try to support people to maintain the reality of relationship even in the face of physical deterioration is something that we can, as Christians and as carers generally, try to support, and is an integral part of palliative care.
Thank you. Well, we're going to come back to that question of autonomy in a moment. But Edwin, Professor Edwin Hui, what did you make of that interview and of this new legal situation in Canada?
Yeah, that's very interesting because as soon as this bill went into the Parliament in Ottawa, I reflected to myself that when I first become start my career as a medical ethics in the 90s, I was the Canadian Society was confronted by a case almost identical to that of Gloria Taylor, which spearheaded this whole campaign to have Bill 14 passed, and that's a Canadian woman struck with same disease, Lou Gehrig's disease, in the early 90s. And who won, in fact, took the matter to court, first in the BC province and then later in the Canadian Supreme Court. Now, she lost the case and was denied the kind of exemption that Gloria Taylor was granted. So we can see that in the span of 20 years, obviously, the Supreme Court, as well as the society, has bought into this idea that we are in control. It's very interesting that if you reflect on these two cases of Sue Rodriguez and Gloria Taylor, that both women are asking for this or assume that we all have this kind of control. I have a quote here from Sue Rodriguez when she presented herself in the BC Supreme Court and challenged the judges. He said, if I cannot give consent to my own death, then whose body is this? Who owns my life? And then it's very interesting to see that 20 years later, Gloria Taylor similarly challenged the judges and say, I want the legal right to die peacefully at the time of my own choosing. I cannot even say precisely when that time will be, but there will be some point in time when I'll be able to say, that's it. That's the point where life is just not worthwhile. You see, here what we are seeing is that not only the use of the principle of autonomy, but actually the combining that autonomy with the right to die. I don't see too many people addressing why we can have that assumption. That is not only that we are autonomous, we are also autonomous to die. We not only we have the right of self-determination, we are self-determined to die. And nobody has really asked that question and accepted it as an assumption. And I think Christians must reflect on this matter. And it's very interesting to see how actually this whole idea of right to die evolved from the right to life. Initially, the right to life is simply a right not to be harmed as an innocent person. But gradually, it has evolved to become that we own our life, we control our life, and we have the right to live our life in ways we want according to our value, beliefs, and preferences. So we have this expanded right to life. This would apparently justify our right to death. And I seriously doubt that it would stand up to any closer moral scrutiny.
So we've touched on this issue that Ellen Weeb raised about autonomy and control as far as dying is concerned. So Edwin, let's just explore this a bit further. I mean, how do you approach this question when it comes to choosing the timing, the manner of one's own death? I mean, what's the issue here for you?
Well, I think this claim to right of life, and admittedly, Dr. Weeb admitted that it's a matter of control. So the claim to right to die is not so much a desire to die, but it's a desire to be able to control and perhaps manipulate the process of dying. And that's important. As one writer used to say, and I always remember what he said, in fact, it's Nigel Cameron. He said, the right to die may be construed as an ironic claim to the right to move straight from a state of health to that state of being dead without, as it were, having to die at all. You see, there's not so much a right to die, but it's the right to avoid the dying process. Okay? So in this sense, this whole movement of autonomous or self-determination to die amounts to nothing less than a denial of death. So I see that as, yeah.
You've worked in both practice medicine in both Western and the Chinese context. I mean, is there a difference here culturally in the way we approach this business of the autonomy of the individual?
Oh yes, yes. Like in your introduction, you said I taught at Hong Kong U. Yes, I was there for 8 years, and really, there's no occasion for me to even give lectures on this subject, other than what's exactly what is minimally required for the medical students, because you do not talk about this sort of things, and it is a very complicated difference, which I would perhaps talk a little bit about.
Well, I mean, it's an obsession of ours in the West as opposed to other parts of the world.
Exactly. I'm sure there's a way that the Chinese people also refuse to accept their mortality and refuse, therefore, to accept human finitude. But for the West, I think this whole movement of autonomy and right to die are explicit expressions that of a failure to face human finitude, and therefore using the right, in other words, the right to die is merely a mask to hide modernity's denial of death, and I think that's actually my reflection on Bill C-14.
Tim, you've obviously had to deal with people who maybe have asked you to advance their death. But how do you approach this business of autonomy here? I mean, and control. I mean, one could be very philosophical about all this, but doesn't it actually come down to basic things about fear and not wanting to kind of die in an undignified way?
Well, let me tell you a story. I remember on my ward round a number of years ago, sitting in front of a man who was a golf professional. So he was an intelligent, educated man who, his life had been out there being active. And sadly, he had lung cancer, and he had developed spinal cord compression, so he could not walk, and he could see no value in his life whatsoever. And he asked me if I could undergo it. And I sat down and talked to him in the ward there, and just began to explore with him the family situation. And it turned out that he had a son who he was estranged from and hadn't spoken to for 17 years. And he had a wife who, the golf pro job, gave him a tied house. So he had no house left for his wife to live in. And exploring those things suddenly made him realize that there was work for him to do. And there was things where, even though he couldn't walk and he couldn't play golf ever again in his life, but there were things of enormous value and importance which he still needed to do. And that was my point about autonomy. He could still act autonomously as a husband and a father, even though he was very limited physically. And I think often the strength of the palliative care approach is that it incorporates not just the physical, but the psychosocial and emotional and the spiritual. And it's bringing all of these things together, which can so often provide people with the support that enables them to have the tools to face the normality of death in a way that is, as Edwin has said, it doesn't deny it, but actually recognizes it and prepares for it.
But sort of leaving the kind of the philosophy of it aside, as it were, or even kind of theological concerns. When it boils down to it, the case study that Ellen Wiebe gave was of a woman who didn't want to choke to death. She knew that that's what the final stages of her condition would mean. So, is that really about autonomy?
No, I think. So there are pictures painted of death, and people who are not familiar with it listen to these pictures, and there is a lot of fear. I've not been a physician who's cared for people with motor neuron disease, but in conversation with people who have, the vast majority of people with motor neuron disease, just like the vast majority of people with cancer, don't actually want to hasten their death. They want to make the most of life. And choking to death is something that's out there. It's said, everybody says this is what's happened. But actually, I understand that's a rare event. So, there is a lot of stuff out there that builds fear, and we need to relieve fear, and that's part of the story. So, I recognise the story as one which is out there, but the pictures are painted.
We've got a question from someone in our audience. It's Robin from Toronto, who asks, what makes suffering a rational basis for suicide and not a condition to be treated? What makes suffering a rational basis for suicide and not a condition to be treated? Philip, would you like to have a crack at that?
Sure, I suppose. We can offer treatment, but we cannot compel treatment. There certainly are situations where somebody is suffering. We know that we can do something about that, but they, for whatever reason, refuse that treatment. Unless they are deemed incompetent and can't make decisions for themselves, there is that sense where under law we have to respect that. Now, why someone would make that choice is a bit of a question. I was thinking as we were having this conversation about Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning, and that whole question around, the place of hope in this. Those who had a reason to live survived the concentration camps more than those that had given up. So how do we help help people find a sense of hope, meaning, and purpose in their suffering that perhaps enables them to be resilient enough that they can endure what would otherwise be unendurable? And I think that the question around sort of relationships and is there still meaning and purpose in our lives? Are we still doing things even if we may be dying? Are we still living? Are we still contributing to the lives of those that we love and who love us? And I think that if we can help people find that sense of purpose and hope, that ameliorates the suffering, hopefully to a degree, that they may make the choice to continue to their existence and to continue to bring good into the world, rather than seeing themselves only as those who are suffering and those who are in pain.
So, I mean, there's a gulf in worldview here, isn't there? About
yeah. Yeah, and I suppose, I mean, part of my work in spiritual care is often to help people find that sense of meaning, hope, and purpose in what they are experiencing. You know, we have all of those wonderful stories of, you know, even of people who are not identified as believers, you know, the human spirit that can overcome tremendous odds. We think of, you know, in Canada, somebody like a Terry Fox, who loses his leg to cancer, but is not someone who then just sort of retreats away from life, but actually engages it and goes on a marathon of hope. You know, what is it that we can learn from people like that, or those other stories that can inspire people to overcome all kinds of difficulty in their lives? And again, that's going to be a very subjective and personal thing, but to help people actually explore those. So yeah, as much as possible. It's not that we are giving hope, but they're helping them find the hope.
All of you have been engaged in palliative care in one way or another, and have encountered people in significant places of suffering. Have you ever encountered a situation in your professional life where you thought it would be morally acceptable, better for the patient, to bring about the end of their life? I mean, Edwin, have you ever been in that situation?
Yes, I think I can say affirmatively that in fact, it will immediately bring to mind exactly that patient who had not sufficient blood flow to her bowel, and we call it intestinal ischemia. And then she ended up really have one section about anywhere between 6 to 10 inches of bowel resected every other day for almost 2 weeks until there's no bowel to cut. The patient, for some reason, still continued to survive, and so on and so forth. Now, I think that patient, in my mind, endured tremendous pain, okay, and suffering, not only for herself and for people around. Now, you almost attempted to think that, well, this is the case. If there's a case that merit assisted dying, but this should be the case, okay. But on the other hand, you will find that the patient had a very close family. She was simply surrounded by love, care, and passion, and she seemed to be quite oblivious to the kind of suffering that we, as outsider or bystander, watching her. And you know, she never did ask for end of life or anything like that. But I'm sure she complained in the sense that why do I have to have this pain? This pain is more than what I can bear. What I'm trying to say is, I was amazed by the testimony by Dr. Weeb just now, that this whole idea about asking for assistance has to be autonomous, has to be competent. It becomes a one-person thing. You know, it's a lonely person seeking to end his life as a way to minimize suffering. But whereas the patient, towards that end of life, this is not the only concern that she has. I mean, she keeps referring to the fact that there's a difference between this type of dying versus palliative care, because 5% of the palliative care patients is not enough for them. And that's interesting. But what we are offering, they're offering just another massive dose of medication, and another medical procedure to end the life. But what the patient really need is not another biomedical intervention. Because we forget that the dying patient, switch to a different mode, and the doctors and the carers need a different paradigm. Instead of biomedical intervention, is what Philip is just basically say is biopsychosocial spiritual paradigm. Unless we can switch, unless the care providers switch to the paradigm, I think we are not doing the right thing.
Tim, have you ever been in a situation where you thought it really did think it was the best thing for the to bring about the end of a patient's life?
And it's a strange dichotomy that the people who actually asked me to end their life have been those who have not fallen into that category, and yet there have been many people whose suffering has been extreme, who, rather as Edwin has said, have been accepting of things, and in the context of their families or even in their own, who've passed on. So I want to ask the question about depression, because a healthy person who wishes to end their life, standing on the edge of the bridge, we will go and we will talk them down and we will seek to help them get treatment so that they don't end their life. And yet a sick person who wishes to end their life, we will say, okay then, we know that depression is very common in people with previous diseases. We know that it's underdiagnosed. I noticed that in the Canadian law there is no requirement for a psychological or psychiatric assessment. And how do we know that the people who are coming to ask for assisted treatment are not the very ones who are on top of their physical condition who also suffering from emotional and psychological depression? Very difficult to sort out, but it's not even considered as far as I can understand from the Canadian law.
It's pretty understandable that somebody who's dying is depressed, right?
Yeah, but depression is actually a treatable condition. And what I think what Edwin and Philip and we've all said is that the majority experience is that people are actually encountering the difficulties of their dying process, but are adjusting to it. And walking that path, yeah, it's tough. There are ups and downs, but actually many of them are not wishing to end it, and many of them are actually adjusted to it and coping with it. Mm-hmm. And yet there's another group who are not. And some of it is philosophical, and there is a difference in their opinion, but there's another group where I think that there's an emotional and psychological angle to it, which we ignore at our peril. When people are coming forward asking for death, assisted death, we need to be very careful.
Whether we like it or not, this is something that's now legal in Canada, assisted dying, and of course this raises the question of how Christian doctors, medical providers are to respond. Philip, what is your response to this? I know you work in a Catholic for a Catholic care provider. Have you taken a stance on this? Is there a Christian stance on this?
I don't know there's a Christian stance on anything, let alone this. But certainly I think there is a stance that many in the Christian tradition would say maybe a way to work with this ethically and responsibly. And let me just be clear that I'm speaking right now as me rather than on behalf of Providence Healthcare. So if there's any disagreements between me and the official positions of my association or the organization I work with, just to be clear that their position will take precedence over what I'm saying right now. But I think it's consistent. One of the things that we have said in Catholic healthcare is that we are not going to make referrals to practitioners who are going to end somebody's life. What we will do is make referrals to organizations where that is a treatment option, where it's not a treatment option within our healthcare facilities. My understanding of how this is likely to play out in British Columbia is that there will be this service provided on a regional basis. So not the expectation that every healthcare facility will be, engaged in medically ending people's lives, but there will be some facilities in each part of the province. So if there is the case where they are being referred to that facility, then the process kicks in. Then they need to be assessed as to whether or not they meet the eligibility criteria. You know, are they of sound mind? Are they capable of making these decisions? Is there coercion from family or others? So then the process would happen there. So our job is not to refer people who will do it. Our job is to refer people to a place where that is an option, even if we're not providing that option, and might actually promote palliative care or other means of people treating what they're going through.
Edwin, do you think there's a particular response that you would want to encourage on this for medical professionals as far as dealing with the practicalities of this law? I mean, there are issues of conscience here, obviously, but you know, practically speaking, how does one deal with this?
I think the number of people actually seriously asking to be assisted to die is not huge. Even by Dr. Weed's admission, only 5% of the palliative care patients would probably need it. So I think it's important for, but on the other hand, I see that this is a very cultural thing. And I think medical Christian doctors should take advantage of this and make a very strong stand and indicate to the world that we have nothing to do with it. Because our doctrine, our beliefs are very clear. We are created to be dependent beings, dependent on God from day one to the last day, every minute of our life, and dependent on people, our community, our family, particularly when we are young and when we are old. Okay, so there's no if and buts about it. I mean, the smile on the patient's face after he was given this end-of-life treatment is simply a false optimism, as if that person has death conquered. No, we don't. Our life, you know, death is a major suffering, but this is part of our lot. Okay? And so we have to make clear the sort of creator and creature relationship that we have. And in light of that, to claim that we have the right to die is nothing less than a very arrogant rebellion against God, just like those guys who built the Babel Tower.
That's to talk very Christian language, though, isn't it? You know, yes. In a kind of context where we're having to offer care to all sorts of people, is that, you know, can you really take that kind of line as a serious professional?
Yes, because I take exception with Dr. Weeb to say that the primary responsibility of a palliative care physician is to minimize suffering. Now, I think as a Christian, our job is not well, put it this way: our job is not to eliminate suffering, because what the secular world has offered is very simple. That our primary job is to minimize and eliminate suffering, but unfortunately, the means is by elimination of the sufferer. So in that context, I think Christian doctors do not have in their agenda top on the list minimizing and elimination of suffering, but it's maximizing of care, compassion, and love. So we do have some alternative, and that is we don't abandon our patients, and we provide all the care that she needs during the suffering.
Tim, I know that you've taken quite a strong stand against this this kind of legislation coming in the UK, and you're particularly concerned about the impact of assisted dying on the doctor-patient relationship. Why does that concern you so much?
Well, thank you. I think there are two particular things. One is, often in our conversations with patients, we talk about what are the range of options. I'm very frequently dealing with people with advanced cancer where one option of dealing with further chemotherapy or palliative care. And the introduction of this bill will mean that there's another option on the table, which is to end it all. And I understand from colleagues in the Netherlands that that becomes very much a matter of options on the table, indeed consultation number 2, if it comes. So I think that changes the dynamic, because what we're concerned about is work in the National Health Service. A health service, it's not a death service. We're concerned about life and health, and to introduce the administration of death as part of our armamentarium, I think is rather profound effect. Not only on doctors, but on patients' perception of doctors, who bring the people with that power. We have enough power in our society without giving them more. I think the second thing that concerns me is the normalisation of this. That if this becomes a normal part of our practice, then what we see is an erosion of the controls on. So in the Netherlands, the first 10 years of euthanasia, the number of people euthanized doubled, 4,000, and the indications increased gradually. So the Netherlands has an exceptionally good healthcare service with extremely pragmatic and sensible people, and it concerns me that this would become, that this could spread further and wider in healthcare services which are less good and for economic pressure. And so I think the normalisation is a big issue.
So you want to if this is going to happen, you feel strongly that it shouldn't be the doctors who kind of normally care for people, the general practitioners, the people in the hospitals who should do this, but another class of doctors entirely.
Well, I think that there's an argument to be made for that. And I think that taking it out of the normal healthcare, because if it's in the normal healthcare, then it distorts that personal relationship between the doctor and the patient. And in a sense, what people are asking for is not, this is something different. This is a death service, not a health service. And what people are wanting as they go to Dignitas and so on, is they want some person who happens to be medically qualified to do something to them which ends their life. And that, as I see it, is not in continuity with healthcare, which is what makes an involved in
Okay, Philip, what's your? Do you feel that this has fundamentally altered the kind of relationship of medical and care providers to patients?
Yeah, I mean it's now something that we have to opt out of. So the scope of our practice, of our profession in healthcare, has been changed. Something is being added to that was not present before, namely the intentional ending of someone's life, and now we have to opt out of that. It may be an analogy when I was thinking of people who I colleagues who work in corrections. When you are a correctional officer in a state, even where capital punishment is practiced, you have to opt into being part of that group that would actually carry out the execution. Just becoming a prison guard doesn't mean that you automatically have to do that. If somehow in our healthcare system we could recognize that this is not something that is routine, normal, just the state of affairs that we have to accept, but that only those who, in their conscience, can say that they can carry it out would be able to do that.
And do you feel that there have been enough provisions made in the Canadian law for kind of opt-out, on the basis of conscience? Or you think
I think
pressure being put on people who work in the normal kind of, not in the religious sector, but in the kind of, the widespread, the secular sector, if you like?
Yeah, and that's part of the challenge of this, is that healthcare has both sort of provincial and federal aspects to it. So I think that in a place like British Columbia, there probably will be pretty clear safeguards around people opting out for reasons of conscience. In a place like Quebec, that is increasingly becoming a secular place, and then sort of prides itself and values itself as not allowing for religious objections or even practices like in terms of how you dress. I think that there will be certainly pressure in Quebec to expect everybody who's part of the healthcare system there to be on board with this practice. So I think that there are going to be provincial, regional differences.
Edwin, do you have anything to say on that matter on the question of conscience and opt-out?
I think from the perspective of a care provider, we have the experience with opting out to provide abortion to build on, and so this will be the mechanism to opt out of putting patients to the end of death, to the end of life, will be developed along those lines. And now, but I'm more concerned about patients opting out. I read a couple of surveys a couple of years ago in Europe that there are patients who do not want to be treated. Now, of course, they do not want PAS, physician-assisted suicide themselves, but they also do not want to be seen by a doctor, treated by a doctor who practices PAS. Okay, and now that the patient need to have a mechanism to opt out, to be under the care of someone, and I think this is extremely informative. That there are patients who do not want to be treated by a physician because they don't want to be treated by a physician who save lives, but at the same time, as a last resort, also ends life. This is a simplistic way to depict it, but there's some element of truth there. But the underlying mindset for those patients is extremely interesting. So the opting out is not just for the care providers, but also for patients.
We need to bring this this conversation to a close. But we've got a question from Jane in British Columbia. She asks about the response of the churches to all of this, and Ellen Weeb actually in the part of the interview that we didn't hear, she challenges Christians on this, not to be kind of judgmental. How do we actually respond at a church level and in terms of the real concerns that people have about the end of their lives, bringing a kind of an element of mercy and love into this conversation? Tim?
Well, I think whether we're dealing with it in that situation or we're discussing the pros and cons of it, we must recognise the seriousness of the issue. We must realise the distress and suffering that people are in. We must recognise that people are coming to it from different worldviews from our own. That doesn't mean we walk away from our worldview, our Christian view of life, valuing life and recognising God's place in the world. But we must recognise the distress that people have, and I think, as Philip said, our role is to walk with people alongside them on this very difficult journey, and that's what we must do with the families. And we can point people in the direction of other ways, of the things we've been talking about, the role of spiritual, social and emotional care, as well as the physical, of keeping people in relationship, and all of these things. But I don't think judgment helps. It's not our role to judge, it's our role to support and help.
Philip, how do you think Christians and Christian professionals particularly can respond here with something that is really kind of contributes by way of mercy and love?
There's an expression in palliative care that people die the way they lived. And I think that the church and Christians need to be involved in working with people, not just on their deathbed, but I mean the things that we've always done. So the more that we can help people experience a worthwhile life, the more that we can be charitable and kind and considerate and compassionate and all those sorts of things. Especially, I think, for example, as people are aging. Some of our concern will be, as people are getting older and they're sort of, waiting for God to take them, will they want to hasten that process? If they've got a life that is rich and full and has quality to it, they'll be much less likely to go that route. So maybe getting involved with more senior care would be an important
Good.
that.
Thank you, Philip. A final word from you, Edwin.
Oh, I think we should expand our educational program in the church, because I'm afraid that what we have said, a lot of things that we have said today, is very useful to Christians, because many Christians die the same way non-Christians die. Now, maybe not as many Christians seek assistant death, but the mindset is the same, and they suffer. So I think we should start from scratch, from the very basic, uh, examine our relationship with God as in the proper creature and creation, with our finitude, with our cycles of growing and aging, and that we are not independent entities, but we are always dependent on God and our neighbors, and that's why
Thank you. We need to stop there, Edwin. We're out of time, I'm afraid, on
we
this
maximize
important
love and care. We
discussion.
maximize love and care, and not
Yeah.
eliminate suffering. Yeah.
Thanks to Ellen Wiebe for her interview, and to Edwin Hui, Philip Weaver, and Tim Morn for being with us today. We appreciate your wisdom and experience that you each bring to this topic. And thanks to you, our audience, for your questions. Sorry we weren't able to get to all of them, but hope you'll continue thinking about these issues and discussing them with others. In a few hours, we'll be posting this program on the Redux page, so please feel free to share it with friends. If you have further questions for our panelists, feedback on today's broadcast, or even ideas for future discussions, you can send them our way through the questions box at redux.net. We look forward to seeing you next time, but from now, from all of our team at Regent College, goodbye.